AP Literature students. Kristian Kuhn coming at you for another writing workshop, affectionately known as the Bob Ross of Composition. And I got set 2 from the 2023 exam, FRQ 1, Ellery Channing's The Barren Moors. And as you've seen lately, I've been making my video student-facing versus teacher-facing. So students, I'm going to be talking to you in this one. And what I've done, I got a big project up my sleeve here. I'm going to make writing workshop videos from 2015 all the way to the present, unpacking FRQ 1, 2, 3 for AP Lit, and I'm going to do the same for AP Lang. So many of you know I've been an AP Lang and an AP Lit teacher for 20 plus years, so I'm pretty well versed in this, and I will walk you through how I teach my own students here in Rochester, New York. So let's start with the prompt and unpack this. It says, in William Ellery Channing's poem, The Barren Moors, published in 1843, the speaker addresses moors, open expanses of wild, uncultivated land. Read the poem carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how Channing uses literary elements and techniques to develop a complex portrayal of the speaker's experience of this natural setting. And this was unusual. My students actually struggled with this one, and they felt very compelled to exclusively unpack the setting. And I'm like, you're kind of being very literal about this, because the prompt is saying the elements and the techniques that Channing uses. So he uses a lot of various techniques and devices to cultivate a sense of this barren moor, and you have to highlight all of those in the essay. So what I'm going to do is walk you through a construction of the entire essay and kind of isolate the things that I saw working in the poem. And here's the kicker. I'm very experienced at doing this. I write for my students all the time, and I actually struggle to do this. So teachers that are watching this particular video, I would try my hand at writing some introductory paragraphs, some body paragraphs, and even throw a couple tagging conclusions on. It is harder than it looks. So I actually struggled with this one. I usually can bang, a whole writing workshop out in about 30 or 40 minutes. And I had to rack my head quite a while for this one. And it was bit of arduous labor. So when we start with a blank canvas, we have to ask ourselves this question. So how do I write the introductory paragraph? And here's the kicker, my friends, right? I say this to students all the time, and when I teach teachers, I tell them the same thing. You gotta Bob Ross your instruction. In order for this process to make sense, I have to get to the proverbial easel and canvas and paint with and for students while manipulating a heuristic. A little known secret about Bob Ross is that he exclusively used the wet-on-wet technique, which was the title of his heuristic, whenever he did a natural landscape. And whenever I perform expository writing, so that encapsulates everything in AP Lang, AP Lit, we're talking rhetorical analysis, argument, persuasion, synthesis, research, literary analysis, so all expository writing, I use the heuristics of the declarative and the inverted thesis to get my introductory paragraphs out of the way. And then for all body paragraphs across the modes, I manipulate a heuristic known as the syllogistic method. And if you sit tight through the entirety of this workshop, you'll see how I pull the strings of those heuristics to cobble together an essay from top to bottom. But I have late breaking news, top secret news, the key to the door of everything. Implicit in that prompt are 2 questions, and here they are. What is the author's intent, and how does the author construct meaning? My beloved students, if you answer those questions correctly, if you've ascertained a really good, impeccable read of the poem, you are going to have a slam dunk thesis point if you adequately respond to both of those questions. I'm going to show you how to also be in contention for the all-elusive unicorn point, that dastardly thing known as the sophistication point, and we'll try to get you all of those elements and components in your writing all put together so that you score as high as possible with regards to this particular FRQ. So what my students do is this. We exclusively use the inverted thesis for FRQ1, FRQ2, and FRQ3. So once you get really good at wielding the inverted thesis, you can write your entire AP Lit exam exclusively with this heuristic. You don't even need to consider the declarative thesis. So let's unpack what the inverted thesis necessitates. So it is 4 sentences. I really like it when my students take 4 sentences to house everything in the introductory paragraph. I find personally that the students that write the 1-sentence bagger, they tend to just have a literary terms dumping ground. And sure, you're going to get the thesis point, but I think it kind of precludes you from getting the sophistication point. I would love to see some data from the College Board on that. You know, the percentage of kids that get the elusive point writing the 1-sentence approach to the thesis versus a fully fleshed out introductory paragraph in like an inverted model, an inverted paradigm. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to take 3 sentences and answer that first question. What is the authorial intent? And your teachers might call it something else. They might refer to it as the exigence, universal theme, universal truth. So it doesn't matter how we cloak our language for that question. I call it authorial intent. You got to answer that question in about 3 sentences. And you'll see in my models, I focus heavily on theme when I respond to that question. In the inverted thesis, the thesis is upside down on its head, right? You end with the thesis. And whenever you answer the question, how does the author construct meaning, that constitutes or comprises the thesis. So we're going to answer that question. How does the author construct meaning last? And that's the sentence in which you want to be using your terms, your devices, your techniques. By virtue of doing this, you're going to sprinkle in a little bit of context and background. I don't want you to regurgitate a plot synopsis of the poem, just context and background. It is an academic paper, so I do want to see tier 2 level vocabulary. And what I mean by that is a fair amount of SAT level caliber words. In my classroom, I run intensive word study academies, so my students have ample opportunity to augment their vocabularies exponentially over the course of the academic year. Couple that with my Nuance Academy, where they learn about the 12-sentence types and the 20-sentence patterns. You're going to get some really good sentence constructs going to yield good voice rhythm and flow. So as far as sentence constructs go, I have some videos in my YouTube channel to teach the patterns and the types. And students, give a little practice at those, because ultimately what trips young, struggling, emerging writers up is that they overuse or over-rely on independent clauses and short, simple declarative sentences, so that your tone when you write sounds like da-da, 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 da-da. And you don't want to do that. That totally will prevent you from earning the sophistication point. So let's recap this. 3 plus 1. 3 authorial intent, 1 construction of meaning. Let's get a sense of what that looks like on paper. Here's exemplar number 1. As paradoxical as it may sound, a man can only recognize unadulterated joy when he experiences the pure freedom of nature's solitude. Without the silence of solitude, unfettered freedom cannot be actualized. And in a likewise manner, it is only when man is truly cut off from all worldly thought and possession that he can experience a piece of heaven. Now I'm at the 4th sentence, all right? Drop the thesis, construction of meaning. William Ellery Channing comes to such an understanding in his poem, The Barren Moors. And immediately you might say, but Kristian, where are your terms, your devices, your techniques? So I'm going to focus on theme primarily in this essay as I conclude it, because I think in talking about theme and also introducing my lit terms, techniques, devices in the first premise of the syllogistic method in the body paragraphs, I will get to those terms. So this is called withholding in mind, withholding the thesis in mind. Now, I know some of your teachers might say, don't take Kristian's advice on this. There is a thesis in here, right, in that last sentence. But some AP readers might say, hey, kid didn't drop the terms of the devices techniques. I'm not going to award him the thesis point. So there is a danger in this. I like this approach because in the first premise, which we'll get to in just a second, the student will explicitly state the terms of the devices, the techniques. So I think AP readers, if they're alert and awake and have a couple cups of coffee in them, they'll be like, oh yeah, absolutely, dude, there's a thesis in there, and it's in the inverted paradigm. But there is a risk, and I admit that. So my better writers, I say, sure, go ahead and you can imply the terms or withhold them in mind and get to them later. My struggling, emerging writers, I'm like, nah, I want you to explicitly state it so that you absolutely get the thesis point. That might be a tad bit confusing, so let's roll the tape again and look at exemplar number 2. And in this one, I am going to state the terms in the construction of meaning sentence, in the 4th sentence. So follow along here. First 3 sentences, authorial intent. Last sentence, construction of meaning. There's a fundamental difference between loneliness and solitude. While on one hand, loneliness expresses the pain of being alone, solitude expresses the pure bliss and heavenliness of being alone. The difference in this recognition is crucial to the understanding of one's individual freedom and ultimate happiness. So look what I do differently in this 4th sentence. I'm going to state my terms and devices. In the poem, The Barren Moors, Channing arrives at such a truth through the paradoxical interplay of nature's simple complexities. I think the paradox is really huge in this, and I'll get to the setting, obviously, and answer the prompt later on in the essay. I don't need to dog it in the introductory paragraph. So you can see in both examples, my vocab is up without overdoing it. I really like to disabuse students of the following notion. If I use $1 million words, I somehow am doing phenomenal writing. No. Stay in your wheelhouse, stay in your lane, sound natural. You don't want to be contrived or pretentious, but you do have to flex your vocab, your academic vocab, a tad wee bit. And also note the sentence constructs in both my exemplars thus far. I'm not paralleling my syntax. And what I mean by that, I'm not dropping, say, for example, independent clause, followed by independent clause, followed by independent clause. Because you're going to get a very droning, monotonous rhythm if you do that. So there's a nice musicality to my writing. There's a good flow because I'm manipulating my syntax at sentence level, and there's variation in each one. All right, students might be scratching their heads saying, I can't do that, Kristian. Oh, yes, you can. Let me show you one more time and unpack how to do the 3+1. In order to hear the divinity of one's natural voice, one must be engulfed with an ineffable silence. Away from the hustle and bustle of man's contrived world, nature can provide such a respite. To hear this voice, pure silence is needed, a silence that only natural landscapes can provide. 4th sentence, hit me with the terms, the devices, the techniques. Channing, rather paradoxically, through a series of similes and syntactical manipulations, arrives at such a truth in his poem, The Barren Moors. So note the vocab in this. Let's unpack this a little bit. So I have words like divinity, engulfed, ineffable, bustle, contrived, right? Respite. So my vocab is up in this. Note how none of the sentences parallel each other. Exactly 4 sentences. First 3 sentences are authorial intent. Big focus on the theme, the universal truth. Last sentence, get me with the terms, the devices, the techniques. And that, my friends, is how you do an introductory paragraph for FRQ1. So give it a whirl. Good time to pause Do the 3+1 yourself. Students, show each other your writing. I'm a firm believer that the more writing you see, the better you become. Teachers, maybe you want to give a couple of exemplars yourself and give that a try so that you can further elucidate things for your students. Still a ton of canvas left, so we pose the next question. So, how do I write the body paragraphs? And as I've already alluded to, you are going to employ the syllogistic method. Here's what that looks like. It's when you argue from premise, conclusion. It's rooted in the Aristotelian tradition. Aristotle ran a school called the Lyceum, and the townsboys would go there to learn about polemics, oration, debate, wordsmithing, word wrangling. And they'd throw out these juicy essential questions. And one of them is in a seminal text called Plato's Republic. And the essential question is, what is justice? And all these great philosophical think tankers step to the proverbial mic and they drop their definition of justice. And Aristotle, like us composition teachers, said, geez, some kids are phenomenal at this and other kids, they really struggle. What's the difference? And he opened up the lid of the really good orators' brains and he said, I got it. They're arguing with like a mathematical calculative formula, and he coined it the syllogism. That was his eureka moment, and he gave examples to his students like, I'm going to give you one right now. And he said, premise 1, arsenic is deadly. If I were to say that to you, you would all nod and say, you're right, Kristian, arsenic's deadly. I know that. But if I follow it up with the second premise and state, my dog ate arsenic, you're going to naturally conclude, uh-oh, Kristian, that's not going to bode well for your dog. Your dog is going to die. So how do we take that heuristic and morph it into a heuristic for the purposes of performing literary analysis? It'll look like this. First premise. The first premise is an argument containing the terms, devices, techniques. So as you can see here with that first introductory paragraph, it's okay to withhold in mind if you are writing syllogistically. But again, I'll admit there is a danger in doing that. You have to be really articulate and crystalline clear up in that introductory paragraph if you are going to imply versus explicitly state the terms. That first premise is going to be a 3-sentence move, and I always want my students to take 3 sentences because it keeps the centrality of the argument. Typical pitfall or snafu among students is they begin to quote and paraphrase, and I even think plot summarize in sentences 1, 2, and 3, and therefore they cease to be performing literary analysis. They're doing plot summation, they're doing plot analysis, and you're not meeting the demands of the assignment if you do that. So the 3-sentence move is kind of a bulletproof way to ensure that you are meeting the demands of the assignment and writing literary analysis from top to bottom. Second premise begins the 4th sentence, and this is where we're going to teeter-totter the textual support in the form of quoting and paraphrasing. You don't want to do one far more at the expense of the other, so I tell my students to kind of weigh those out on equal grounds. And then body paragraphs need to be concluded. And this is where I tell students, go back to the thesis, go back to the prompt. It's like a link or an echo or a promise to the first premise. And I'll model that for you. So let's break this down bit by bit and take a look at what a first premise looks like. I don't really give my students too many sentence stems because I don't want to steal their thunder. I want my kids to be independent thinkers, and I know that they're really capable of generating and garnering ideas on their own. But if a student gets stuck, I give them 4 words, and they are as follows. Right from the onset. And here's the reason why I give students those 4 words, even the comma. They often say, where do I begin my first body paragraph? And I say, start where Channing starts. Start where the poet starts. And you can do this for FRQ too as well. So if you have a methodological approach, if you have a chronological approach, you're going to stay organized and tend to keep that line of reasoning intact. And I tell them, just go top to bottom, cross weave when necessary. So you drop those 4 magic words and it cues your reader into knowing that you, my friend, are extremely organized. So look what I do with the terms, the devices, the techniques in these 3 sentences. Right from the onset, Channing creates a sense of the blissful infinitude this natural setting fosters for the narrator through his syntactical manipulations. So I'm going to focus on syntax and setting. So finally I got to setting. Again, I didn't need to dog that in the introduction. In drawing a comparison between loneliness and solitude, so I could call that a juxtaposition or a binary, the author gives voice to the strange paradoxical overlap of the two. So I got paradox in there. To highlight the intense impact the setting has on the speaker, Channing also employs a number of nature-based similes to further convey his central theme. So what I don't want my students to do is 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph similes, 1 paragraph setting. That's too plodding, dutiful, definitely going to preclude you from getting the sophistication point, and it's just not how good writers write. So you can see I have a whole bevy of things that I have to get to here, and what I do after the first premise is I go textual support hunting. I get into the poem and I'm like, all right, I need setting quotes, juxtaposition quotes, paradox quotes, etc. If I set it in the first premise, it is a promise. I promise you, dear reader, to mention those things. So I always talk about the first premise being a promise. Keep the promise of the first premise. So I have all my quotes and paraphrases for the terms, devices, techniques that I mentioned in that first premise, and I drop them into the second premise. Here's what that looks like. 4th sentence, I typically get quoting right away, and I go right in order in the manner in which I drop things in the first premise. Immediately, in order to convey the endless beauty and wonder of the moors, as well as its heavenly presence, Channing takes several syntactical liberties. Do you see how my first term I dropped in the first premise was syntax? So I'm going to go syntax. Syntax is hard to quote, so I'm going to kind of paraphrase this a little bit and sprinkle in a quote just to really shore things up and keep it teeter-totter balanced. The odd use of the dash, which is preceded by a comma, places added emphasis on the fact that on your bare rocks he loves to lie. Even the repetition of on your bare rocks helps to suggest that the speaker visits these moors more often when he wants, those dim uncertainties that plague him in the world of man, which busy life delights to feel. So let me talk about a template within the template. I call it the 5-word rule. Students, if you place a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keep the quote relatively small, bracket when necessary, it should sound conversational, and that's kind of the epitome of embedding quotes. You want it to sound conversational. So look where I go. I quoted, I have to analyze it. The run-on nature of the opening stanza corresponds to the timeless purity of this singular moment. But as the speaker notes, in a world where loneliness is something typical not to be desired, this particular solitude can fairly sate the passage of his loneliest day. As paradoxical as this may sound, right, because I did talk about paradox in my first premise, I got to get to it in the second premise. It is only when one escapes to such a setting, and I said setting too up there, so I got to do it down here, that the agitating world can come. Only nature can provide such a sanctified reprieve, and the similes speak of this, right? So you can see here, everything that I dropped in the first premise, I got to drop in the second premise. That's a line of reasoning. Channing suggests that the moors are like crags upon the shores of clouds upon a placid sky. Later on, he states that they are even like desert islands far at sea. We know that we cannot end on a quote. We need to conclude that thought. So let's wrap that all up and get back to our thesis statement and wrap it all the way back to the first premise. This usually takes 2 sentences. Sometimes I might need 3 if I have a lot of literary terms, devices, techniques that I'm juggling in the first premise. Nature coupled with solitude is the only thing that can yield such divine feelings. In a world wrought with business and human crowdedness, It is easy to think that happiness can be sought in these corridors. But as Channing reminds us, we are foolish for thinking so. In order to seek the silence most profound, one must totally cut themselves off from all the external noise. And my friends, that is a syllogistic body paragraph. Students often ask, how many sentences should I write? And I tell them to shoot for 10 to 12. That's usually a full body paragraph when you go that route. So our intro and our first syllogism are done. Let's pause here. Students, write your first premise, 3 sentences, drop the terms, devices, techniques, use that stem right from the onset or something closely akin to that. Go quote hunting, paraphrase hunting, and write the whole thing, 10 to 12 sentences. But we ain't done. We have to ask ourselves, what do I do next? Because you just can't write an intro in one body and call it a day. Here's the answer. You bust out another syllogism. What's left? Well, we're only at the middle of the poem, so we have the middle all the way to the end to go. Change up the lit terms. Some of them we're going to recycle. Like we still need to focus on the setting because that was really entrenched in the language of the prompt. And, you know, there's all sorts of syntactical twists in the rest of the poem, so I want to do that again. And there, again, there's still a lot of similes. So we're just going to continue along the same lines. And students, I want you to try that all on your lonesomes and show your teachers, show your friends. You can even send them to me. I have my email address at the end of the video. If you want me to look over your shoulder and give you the nod of approval, I'm happy to do that. But let's wrap this essay up. I have my students use a few conclusion stems, and I liken the conclusion to the grand finale of a fireworks display. Heavy focus on theme, and it usually just takes 3 to 4 sentences to wrap things up. And here are a few of my students' favorite stems. Simply said, evidentially, in no other words, when it's all said and done at the end of the day in a global sense. So crank a conclusion using one of those stems. Ultimately, I want students to get rid of the training wheels and the scaffolds, but for a first crack at things, it's totally cool if you use a stem, not a big deal. So that's it from here. Happy teaching, happy writing. If you want to reach out to me, drop me a line at teachingwritingcoach@gmail.com. Teachers that are viewing this know that I am a lead teacher for the National Writing Project, and I offer PD through them, NCTE Perfection Learning throughout the calendar year. And you can see my calendar of events on my website, which is www.teachinghowtowrite.com. Some are free. Actually, most of them are free. Some are for a nominal fee, and you can check that out. So students, if you would like to work with me as your tutor, I have a program called Write at Ivy Write. I have my graduate degrees from Ivy League schools, so I know fully well the types of college personal statements you need to write, and I also know fairly well what you need to do to score well on your AP Lang and AP Lit exams. So feel free to hit me up and we can work if you so choose. All right, that's it from here. Be well, and like I said at the beginning of the presentation, note that I'll be doing writing workshops from the present exams all the way back to 2015. So stay tuned, come back, view them often, and I will keep loading them as I go.